So today is the third installment of the series that I'm sort of thinking of as Where in the World Was Wendy? This month I'll be sharing my experiences on my trip from the Holy Land. Things that impacted me, things that surprised me, ways that the Bible came alive for me anew. Today we're journeying to Bethlehem, in particular to the Church of the Nativity, the birthplace of Jesus. When preparing for my trip, I was so looking forward to O Little Town of Bethlehem. I had read about the Church of the Nativity, and I was so excited to see the place where Jesus was born. This day was the fourth day on our trip, and throughout these 4 days, I had been filled with a mix of emotions. I had those sacred moments where I felt the presence of God so strongly. But I also had moments of sadness and frustration. As we were darting from site to site in a whirl of photo taking and learning more information than the sponge that is my brain could seem to take in, I experienced a mix of emotions. I was so excited to see this church. In particularly, I was excited to see this door. This is not one of my photos, but this is what I had expected to see, what I was waiting to see, one of the things that I had journeyed from afar to experience. Instead, this was my view. They're doing work on the outside of this church. There was scaffolding and plywood set up outside of the church. And of course, the crowd of people that we had come to expect waiting at these locations, just waiting for their chance to get inside. I was excited to see the door. This door has come to be known as the door of humility. You can see here that from the big arch, it used to be a much larger opening, but in an effort to prevent horsemen from entering the basilica during the Ottoman period, the size of the door was reduced to a mere 4 feet by 2 feet. So now to enter this church, you must bow down and climb through this small door. You have to humble yourself in order to get inside. So we waited for our turn to enter, and I couldn't wait to get inside. I was so looking forward to seeing this ornate Orthodox church. I was expecting grandeur. And instead, I encountered this. The church was dark, and it was covered with scaffolding and protective tarps. Once again, we found ourselves in a long line waiting. This time we were waiting to get into the grotto where they believe that Jesus was born. Instead of spending our time in line, waiting and admiring the amazing mosaics, some of them dating from the 4th and 6th century, we found ourselves in a dark tunnel made by tarps hung between the pillars on the side of the sanctuary. Pillars which I'm sure were ornately decorated underneath of their protective coverings. Some of the pilgrims before us had spent their time waiting, writing notes and leaving their name on the tarps as they passed the time. Through the tarps and scaffolding, we could see just a peek of the beautiful gilded mosaics from the time of Justinian in the 6th century, which were in the process of being restored. I had been so looking forward to seeing these beautiful mosaics. We were waiting in a line to get into the grotto. And so this is not my photograph. This is an image of the grotto where you enter in there, and down inside the grotto is where they believe Jesus was born. And so I had expected to see this. But instead, pilgrims that go to the church now can expect an experience that is a little more like this. This is the entrance to the grotto, people crowding around, waiting for their turn to enter into the sacred space. Inside the grotto, there's an altar with a metal star. I don't know if you can see that there. There's a metal star that's enframing a rock. This is said to be the place, the place where God became flesh and dwelt among us. This rock is polished smooth from centuries of people bending down to touch the stone. We all waited our turn to be able to touch this stone with our own hands. I'd been so looking forward to this holy space. But this holy space was not as peaceful as I was thinking. It looks more like this. I was dreaming of a silent night. In my mind, I had been picturing Mary swaddling the baby Jesus in her loving embrace. But I didn't feel that heavenly peace that I'd been hoping for. It was a crowded, noisy, chaotic, tiny little room full of too many people being rushed through, the next group just impatiently waiting for their turn to get inside. I found it difficult to feel the presence of the holy in this space. And I was frustrated and I was disappointed because I didn't see what I had expected to see. So that evening, I did a little bit of reading about the Church of the Nativity that changed my perspective on the entire experience. I realized how the restoration project, which was a disappointment to us as pilgrims, was actually a beautiful part of the story of this church. Perhaps transforming the scaffolding and the mess into a portrait of beauty. The Church of the Nativity has been on the list of the top 100 most endangered sites since 2008. Structural issues threatened the very existence of this church, one of the oldest churches in the world. Like the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity has representation from several denominations of Christians. The oldest portion of the church that is built over the grotto belongs to the Orthodox. The Catholics have their own church that they built later, which was sort of just tacked on to the side of the Orthodox structure. If you remember from my sermon last week, these groups they have a reputation for not getting along all that well. Sometimes their disagreements even erupt into physical violence. In 2002, the Palestinians recognized that the structure of the Church of the Nativity was a priority and that the building needed to be repaired and restored. The Palestinian leadership led the call for the preservation of this site, seeking help from others for this massive project. The Palestinian leadership and the majority of the Palestinian people are Muslim, yet they recognize the importance of this holy site. This project brought together the Franciscans, the Armenian Orthodox, and the Greek Orthodox into cooperation for the first time in over 100 years. I don't know if you remember from last week, but the Church of the Holy Sepulchre had that ladder that hadn't moved since 1854 because the groups could not get along well enough to figure out what they should do with this ladder, and so it stands for no reason other than they can't decide what to do with it. But now here at the Church of the Nativity, these groups of Christians are working together to save the site. In our trip, we visited many places that had been destroyed by a group that would come into power who didn't agree with the group before, and so they would just destroy what they found. But now here, at this church, there are groups of Muslims and Christians working together to save the site. That makes the scaffolding and the tarps and the mess pretty beautiful, doesn't it? In my frustration of that day, I had found myself wondering, why do so many people feel they need to come to this place, to this church, to seek God? Certainly, it's a connection to the past. We all long to get to the origins of things. We all want to touch and see God for ourselves. But how do we touch and see the intangible, the invisible? Perhaps it is exactly this seeing, this visibility that makes the Church of the Nativity so alluring to so many crowds of pilgrims. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. God became flesh at this church. And in that space, we could touch and we could see for ourselves. Perhaps pilgrimage is all about making the intangible tangible. And perhaps that is why this place, like Jesus himself, is so magnetic. The tangibility of the intangible. And that tangibility of God originated right here in the little town of Bethlehem, the birthplace of the Emmanuel, the God with us. God meets us where we are, and so how else would God come to meet us but as a human? God came as a human, approachable and relatable. I would imagine it's a little difficult to relate to a burning bush or to relate to a pillar of cloud, but through Jesus, God came to us as one of us. In the Church of the Nativity, we are reminded of those humble beginnings. God came as a baby, humbly and helplessly dependent on his young mother for care. In many ways, the life he was born into was remarkably unremarkable. This can sometimes be difficult to remember as we stand in these remarkably glorious churches that commemorate the life of Jesus. But the life of Jesus is a life which began as nothing spectacular by outward appearances. The Son of God was born into a life that was unremarkable by human standards. It had me wondering if Jesus was what the wise men had expected to find as they followed that spectacular star to the place where Jesus was born. They had brought with them extravagant gifts, and I'm sure the place they found was probably more humble than they had expected to find a king. The wise men came to pay homage. They were overwhelmed with joy when they arrived where the star had led them. This final image is a life-size nativity that is in the courtyard between the different portions of this church. When I took this photo, the sun was baking down on us in this crowded courtyard, and I was feeling frustrated and overwhelmed. I turned around and I pointed my cell phone at the nativity and I snapped a picture, but in the bright sun, I had no idea what the picture looked like or if it had even turned out. Later, as I was looking through photos from the day, I couldn't believe my eyes. The sun flare in this photo was perfectly placed to appear like the star that the wise men had followed to find the Messiah. When I gazed at this photo, I was overwhelmed with joy. In the Church of the Nativity, I had not found what I expected to find. When the wise men stopped at the place where the star had led them, I'm sure it wasn't what they had expected, but they humbled themselves, and with great joy they paid homage to the Messiah. They had come a long way, and what they had found was probably not what they had expected to see, but it was beautiful in ways that they never could have imagined. Now, Herod, on the other hand, was not intending to humble himself to pay homage to Jesus. He had his own interests at mind, and they were the opposite of humility. Fortunately, the wise men were warned in a dream and did not return to share the location of the Holy Family with Herod. In our passage from Matthew today, all of this paying homage, the wise men humbling themselves to honor Jesus, had me thinking about the door of humility. One must lower themselves through the door of humility if they want to enter. I've been thinking about how humility really is the gateway to faith. Without humility, we just rely on our own efforts and our own abilities, our own skills and our own talents, and all the wonderful, fabulous things that we think make us great, without recognizing our reliance and our dependence on God. When we rely only on our own aptitude, we remove all possibility. We leave no room for mystery. We leave no room for the miraculous. When we are not willing or able to humble ourselves, we are not able to enter into what God has in store for us. It took humility for the groups of Christians and Muslims who do not always get along to work together for a common goal to save this church. Humility is the key to faith. And fortunately for us, we have a God who humbled himself, putting on flesh, entering the world by passing through the body of a young woman to be born in a humble cave. The letter to the Philippians spells this out, saying that Christ, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equally with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in human likeness and being found in human form. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has also exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that the name of Jesus every knee should bend, and in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Humility is the key to almost everything in our spiritual life. And Jesus has set the ultimate example of selfless humility for us to follow. My prayer is that through our explorations of the humble beginnings of the human life of Jesus, we may be inspired, that we may remember the humility which God put on in the form of human flesh so that we could all know and relate to God. Philippians 2 also tells us that we should do nothing with selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regard others as better than ourselves. Let each of you look not at your own interest, but to the interest of others. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus. Did you hear that last part? Let the same mind that is in you be what was in Christ Jesus. In Jesus, we have an example of humility that we should all aspire to. Walking in the footsteps of Jesus means walking humbly with God.